tonight. Tonight's a special night for us. Coronavirus, it's really made us very secluded, and Upper Hudson Peace Action has taken the opportunity to do something a little different. We are joined tonight by Women Against War, so we're very thankful to say that tonight's talk with Hyun Lee is presented by Upper Hudson Peace Action and Women Against War, and we thank you for your partnership and your friendship, and we look forward to doing more programming with you in the future. Hyun Lee is an anti-war activist and organizer who has traveled to both North and South Korea. She is the national organizer for Women Cross DMZ, Mobilizing Peace on the Korean Peninsula. Hyun's articles appear in the Asian Pacific Journal, The New Left Project, The Nation, and ZoominKorea. Hyun's recent article titled North Korea's Missile Test Aren't Surprising, Biden Has Been Fueling Tensions, will be placed in the chat. In April of 2020, Hyun was a speaker at the Racial Justice Has No Borders Town Hall, working to dispel the myth that more police and more wars create a safer world. In July of 2021, steering committee members of Upper Hudson Peace Action and Women Against War joined Hyun for a virtual Korea Peace advocacy lobbying event with members of Congress, urging them to vote for the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, Enhancing North Korean Humanitarian Assistance Act, and the Divided Families Reunification Act. It was through this lobbying event we reached out to Hyun Lee in the hopes of speaking with us, and we are thrilled to have you here with us this evening, and we thank you, Hyun.
Thank you, Janine. Good evening, everyone. It's really great to see all of you. I actually cannot see anybody on my screen because I guess I'm spotlighted, but I can see all your chats. And it's good to see new and old friends. It is really an honor for me to speak to you tonight. I want to thank Wendy Dwyer and Maud Easter for bringing us all together. To come together on a weekday night to talk about Korea and the conflict going on there. It's dedication. So I'm very honored and very appreciative that you all are gathered here today. And I also want to thank Bob for doing all the tech support for tonight's event. I've done tech stuff for this kind of event in the past, and it's not easy. So thank you so much, Bob, for doing that. And I guess we can get started. Tonight's topic is Korea Peace Treaty and why it is the key to peace in Northeast Asia. Before we get started, I just want to say, you might notice that I cough a lot tonight. Don't be alarmed. It's just a little condition I have, but I'm totally okay. And hopefully it won't be too distracting. So I think, that's the title page is already on the screen. Let me just pull up my own notes and then let's get started. So next slide. Oh, actually, yeah, here. So before we zoom in on Korea, I'd like for us to start with the global picture. And I want to ask you to reflect on the past 20 years. And how did we do on protecting our national security? So the question I want to pose to you, and please feel free to write in the chat. What do you remember about 2001 and the years following 2001? What were you doing? What were you feeling at the time? And I'll just pause for a couple of minutes for people to sort of ruminate on that and write in the chat so we can all sort of share. protesting the terrible US war. Yeah. War making in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yeah, I think many of us were on the streets joining in anti-war protests. The aftermath of 9/11, yep. Challenge corporate globalization, WTO. Immoral, illegal war against Iraq. Yeah, remember Bush getting arrested, marching, Twin Towers. Yep, stop the invasion of Iraq. Yeah, thank you so much. You know, 2001 is the year, obviously, when the US launched its endless war on terror. And it was an era-defining moment in which the US ascended as a unipolar power in the world. But when we look back now, we see that we quickly depleted our resources by pouring trillions into an endless war while our national core suffered. So according to the Cost of War Project, and Bob, I think we can advance the slide now. Keep going, yeah, there it is. We had an estimated 900,000 war dead, 30 to 40 million refugees, more than 7,000 American lives were lost. The cost is US dollars, $8 trillion. And the US refusal to cooperate with other powers, such as Russia and China, has actually resulted in these countries finding common cause and pushing back against American ambitions. So America was at the height of its power when it invaded Afghanistan in 2001. But now, 20 years later, its spectacularly disastrous withdrawal from that country actually marked the end of the age of US global hegemony. Next slide. So today, I think Washington's foreign policy thinkers face new realities, also a weakened war chest. So now they have two possible paths. One is either continue to pursue hegemony and domination, which is ignoring the reality of the US relative decline right now, or adjust to the new international distribution of power by pulling back on the military posturing and negotiate a multipolar system with Russia and China. And when President Biden withdrew from Afghanistan, it seemed that he was actually weaning off of foreign intervention and signaling a drastic change in US foreign policy. He said, as we turn the page on the foreign policy that has guided our nation the last 2 decades, we have to learn from our mistakes. This decision about Afghanistan is not just about Afghanistan. It's about ending an era of major military operations to remake other countries. It sounded really good to me, but next slide. As you know, the military-industrial complex is hardwired for forever war and hegemony. And institutions sometimes persevere long after their usefulness has expired. The defense industry does not simply pack up its things when a war is over. It actually has built-in structural incentives and vested interests that are firmly in favor of continuing down the same path. So it has 700 billion plus in annual spending. So the defense industry will do almost anything to maintain the status quo, sometimes even defying common sense, and also at the expense of our own national security interests. As you well know, defense firms finance think tanks and research centers like the RAND corporations, Center for New American Security, et cetera. They provide their expertise through the media and consulting policymakers. And the top 50 think tanks in the US receive more than $1 billion from the US government and defense contractors annually. And it is also sad to say the leaders of the foreign policy and armed services committees, both the House and the Senate, receive campaign donations from the defense industry. Also, there is an entire industry of NGOs like Freedom House and the National Endowment for Democracy. They promote liberal democracy as a global norm, and they link democracy promotion to empire building projects. Next slide. So now I want us to turn our attention to the next sphere of conflict, and that is the Indo-Pacific region. The Biden administration recently approved the Pentagon's Global Posture Review. So we can advance the slide now. So what is the Global Posture Review? It is a periodic review of the US's strategic objectives around the world, and it informs the draft of the US National Defense Strategy. It is also the basis for the deployment or the redeployment of US forces overseas, which includes US forces in Korea. Next slide. The current Global Posture Review is a classified document, so we don't know the details, but we can go to the next slide. We can actually deduce some main points from a press briefing that was held by the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Capabilities in November of 2021. She said at that press briefing, China is our pacing challenge. The priority is the Indo-Pacific. Also mentioned additional cooperation with allies and partners across the region, need to deter potential military aggression from China and threats from North Korea. Also need greater access for military partnership, enhancing infrastructure in Australia and the Pacific Islands, and planning rotational aircraft deployments in Australia. So in other words, Washington's priority region is the Indo-Pacific. Chinese and North Korean threats are its main concerns. Australia and other Pacific islands will play a key role in the US basing strategy in the region. Next slide. The US seems to be pursuing a new Cold War policy that can fuel a very dangerous conflict in the Indo-Pacific region. Countries in Asia, most notably South Korea, are increasingly forced to choose their allegiance between the US and China. The US is also discussing or devising plans to make the Korean Peninsula the front line of its military front against China. I'm going to talk more about this in the next section. So in 2022, this year, I believe the growing US-China conflict could impact every aspect of our work for Korea peace. So the next slide, now let's turn our attention to how this impacts the Korean Peninsula. This is the part of my presentation where it might get a little bit wonky, but it's not going to be very long, and I'm going to try to make it as clear as possible. So I hope you will stay with me. The next slide. The first concern is the possible redeployment of US forces in Korea. So every year, the defense ministers of the US and South Korea meet at what is called the Security Consultative Meeting. This meeting usually produces a joint statement, and usually they say, oh, we reaffirm our alliance as ironclad, and this is, here's what we're going to do. And every year for the past 12 years, their joint statement had included a clause that restricts the reduction of US troops in Korea. But in 2020, for the first time in 12 years, the joint statement did not contain a clause that restricts the reduction of US troops in Korea. So lawmakers in South Korea we can advance the slide now. Lawmakers in South Korea, they took notice and they immediately questioned the South Korean Defense Ministry about this. And in response to questions from the South Korean National Assembly, a spokesperson of the Defense Ministry said, the US government is considering ways to flexibly adjust the size of US troops stations overseas in response to changes in global defense policy. Rather than continuously maintaining a certain size of US troops in a specific country, we are pushing for a plan to flexibly adjust the force in consideration of the security situation. So one more advance, please. I think what this may mean is that the US Department of Defense is quietly considering a strategic plan to gradually redeploy or restructure the US forces in Korea to eventually contribute to the anti-Chinese military front. Next slide. The second policy change of note is the possible abandonment of strategic flexibility. So previously, the US followed a doctrine called strategic flexibility vis-a-vis its forces in South Korea. According to this doctrine, the US forces in Korea was reorganized into a rapid deployment force, flexibly deployed to other conflict zones, mainly in the Middle East, and then they were rotated back to the US forces in Korea bases for R&R and also training before being redeployed. So this doctrine was necessary to fortify US troops that were fighting in the Middle East. But now the situation is changing. The new situation is the developing conflict between the US and China, most notably in the Taiwan Strait. In recent months, the US Department of Defense seems to have abandoned the strategic flexibility doctrine of the US forces Korea. There's a couple evidences of this. So in September of last year, the DoD permanently deployed a battalion of attack helicopters that were previously rotated every 6 to 8 months at Camp Humphreys in Pyeongtaek. Also, it permanently deployed the 2nd Division Artillery Regiment, which is about 100 troops or so. They had previously been headquartered in Washington State, but now they're permanently deployed in South Korea. So I think what this may mean is that the DoD is abandoning strategic flexibility to switch from rotational deployment to fixed deployment of its forces, mainly to fortify the anti-Chinese military front. Next slide. Also, next slide. Also, the US and South Korea are discussing a new operational war plan. So in November, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and South Korean Defense Minister Seok, they jointly announced plans to develop a new operational war plan. We don't know the details of the new war plan. However, around the same time of this announcement, a retired USFK commander, Robert Abrams, caused a lot of controversy with remarks that wartime plans against North Korea must account for China's militaristic influence in the region. So he said, the Chinese military also has to be accounted for in the war plan, et cetera, et cetera. So I think what this may mean is that the DoD's new war plan for the US-ROK combined forces takes into account the growing escalation of the war threat with China, and may include plans to involve the USFK and combined forces in a potential showdown with China. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, great. Lastly, there is the issue of wartime operational control transfer. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with what this means. Wartime operational control means who commands the armed forces during times of war. In 1950, when the Korean War broke out, South Korean President Syngman Rhee, he gave over the reins of the South Korean armed forces to the United States. And the US has had wartime operational control over South Korean forces ever since. And that has been described as the greatest act of relinquishing one's sovereignty. No other country in the world has this arrangement with another country. And as you can imagine, this creates all sorts of issues related to South Korea's ability to determine its own foreign policy. When someone else is dictating what you can and cannot do with your armed forces, your sphere of foreign policy making is very limited. At any rate, Moon Jae-in's top priority has been to regain wartime operational control before the end of his term. But the requirements that are necessary for a successful OPCON transfer has indefinitely delayed this process, because the requirements are that the South Korean military has to verify that it has secured key military capability to defend itself on its own, that it has the capability to respond to nuclear and missile threats from the DPRK, and also that the security environment on the Korean Peninsula and in the region is stable enough to allow the South Korean military to resume wartime operational control. These conditions are nearly impossible to meet, mainly because the South Korea military has been for a long time reliant on the US military. That has impeded its ability to become fully independent for its own defense. So for example, South Korea relies on US technology for many defense-related capabilities. For example, it does not have its own air reconnaissance capability. Without US technology, it is unable to perform many security-related functions on its own. Also, South Korea's own experts assess that South Korea is currently unable to track and target North Korean ballistic missiles. At any rate, because OPCON transfer is a priority for the Moon Jae-in administration, it has been pushing the US on a timetable. Last year, the US and South Korea did agree to conduct an assessment called Full Operation Capability this year in 2022. The South Korean military has to pass a series of evaluations to determine if it's ready to be in control of its own defense. But this past December, the US DoD confirmed that that assessment will occur in the fall of 2022, not in the spring, which is what South Korea was pushing for. So anyway, what this may mean is that it appears the DoD may be delaying the return of wartime operational control in case the combined US-ROK forces are needed in the anti-Chinese military front. So next slide. In summary, next slide. Yeah, to recap what the growing US-China tension may mean for the Korean Peninsula, in anticipation of a potential conflict with China, the US Department of Defense seems to be, one, quietly considering a strategic plan to gradually redeploy US forces in Korea to the anti-Chinese military front. 2, abandoning strategic flexibility to switch the rotational deployment of its forces to fixed deployment. And 3, delaying the return of wartime operational control in case the joint forces are needed in the anti-Chinese military front. Okay, next slide, please. Now, I'd like to talk about Biden's policy on North Korea and then Kim Jong-un's response so far. So even while tacitly acknowledging that Washington's past policies on North Korea have failed, Biden has not deviated from the old formula, which is to say continued sanctions, military exercises, attacking the country on its human rights record, isolating the country. The Biden administration's outward stance has been, we are willing to meet with North Korea at any time without preconditions. But North Korea has refused to talk, insisting that the US should first drop its hostile policy. So this is the tug of war between the two countries that defines the current stalemate. Next slide. So why is North Korea refusing to talk? Well, we can look at some statements made by Kim Jong-un last year. They might give us some insight as to what North Korea is thinking. So Kim Jong-un at the 8th Party Congress of the Workers' Party of Korea, I think that was in the spring of last year, he said, no matter who is in power in the US, the true nature of the US and its fundamental policy towards North Korea never change. And then at the 5th session of the 14th Supreme People's Assembly, that was in September, he said, the US is touting diplomatic engagement and dialogue without preconditions, but it is no more than a pretty trick for deceiving the international community and hiding its hostile acts and an extension of the hostile policy pursued by the successive US administrations. Next slide. The metaphor, next slide. The metaphor that I think of when I think about the US-North Korea deadlock is someone who has another person in a chokehold. And he's saying, hey, I'm ready to talk at any time. Are you going to talk or not? The ball is in your court. And then the person who is in the chokehold is saying, hey, let go of this chokehold first before we can talk. And I believe that that's what North Korea means when it says the US should drop its hostile policy. Next slide. Now, let's talk about President Moon Jae-in's push for an end of war declaration, because I know that there's some excitement about this possibility in the media and also among peace activists. So I would like to talk about how an end of war declaration is related to our campaign for a peace agreement. So first, what is a peace agreement? A peace agreement represents a final and binding settlement of the ongoing conflict, and it is a step towards lasting peace. So at the very least, it should end all further war threats in the region, end the escalating arms race surrounding the Korean Peninsula, and then lastly, create conditions for peaceful reconciliation and eventual reunification of the Korean people. Next slide. And in this very complicated global and regional context, and with just a few months left in his tenure, President Moon is engaged in a last-ditch attempt to push for an end of war declaration. So at the UN General Assembly in September, he proposed declaring a formal end to the Korean War. And in December, he said, the US, China, and South Korea have agreed in principle to formally end the war, and that he hoped that would generate significant dialogue momentum. North Korea, for its part, has been lukewarm to the idea and it has not made an official statement on the end of war declaration. For Moon Jae-in, an end of war declaration before his term ends may be a way to leave his personal legacy for inter-Korean peace. The Biden administration, on the other hand, has been very keen to put the ball in North Korea's court for the current deadlock. So he wants to be able to say, hey, we're ready to dialogue with North Korea at any time. But it's the North Koreans who refuse to meet us halfway. Next slide. An end of war declaration will not fundamentally change the current trajectory of the US war machine in the Indo-Pacific. And for that reason, many Korean Americans and also South Koreans on the left are sort of agnostic on the idea of an end of war declaration in the current context. But if it is signed, it is an important opportunity to push forward the message that a declaration of the end of war should end all future war threats, end the escalating arms race, and also allow the Korean people to determine their own future. So lastly, before we open up for questions, I want to end by discussing 3 concrete things that I hope we will all commit to this year to support peace on the Korean Peninsula. One is understand the shifting global context, meaning the US drive to a new Cold War paradigm and confrontation against China and North Korea in the Indo-Pacific. Number 2 is we need to align with all pro-peace and anti-war forces to oppose the US war machine's drive toward confrontation against China. And then the last thing is, please get your member of Congress to support HR 3446, Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, which is a legislation that calls for a final and binding settlement of the Korean War. And I know that Women Against War was very successful in getting Representative Paul Tonko to co-sponsor HR 3446 last year. And I know that Wendy and others in Upper Hudson are trying their best to get Gary Delgado. I think he's gettable. That would be a great contribution to get, because our goal is really to build, expand the number of allies in Congress who support the idea of a final and binding settlement of the war. And there is, I know that all of you are engaged in advocacy and meeting with your legislators. So if you can mention this legislation at your next advocacy meeting, that would be great. But there is also, we have a website where you can go to send a message, send a letter to your member of Congress. It's through Action Network. It's very easy to do. So I'll post that link in the chat so people can have access to that. All right, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for staying with me. And I guess we can open up for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Hyun. That was fantastic. I took a screenshot of how to support peace on the Korean Peninsula, and I will email that to everybody who was here this evening. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We already have a few, so while you are getting your thoughts together and typing, I am going to start asking Hyun some questions. So Mickey had asked, the US plans to upgrade a ballistic missile defense system located in South Korea that is supposedly there to protect against North Korea, but could easily be retargeted to threaten China. If this happens, then could it endanger the goal of ending the Korean War and also put the region in the midst of a possible arms race?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. THAAD stands for terminal high altitude area defense. And it is a missile defense system that the United States installed in South Korea back in 2017. It's definitely part of the growing arms race in Asia. Mostly elderly residents in a village called Sosangmi, that's very close to the base, are opposed to the THAAD base. They say that the THAAD was installed without democratic process and in disregard of their opinion on the matter. There are many health and environmental concerns when you're living right next to a missile defense radar. They also worry that if there is a conflict between the US and China, they could be caught in the crossfire because the THAAD radar could be used in that situation. So they, elderly grandmothers have basically blockaded the base with their physical bodies, excuse me, to try to keep construction materials from getting into the base. They have clashed with the police. They have faced criminal prosecution. And on a geopolitical level, THAAD has put South Korea in a very awkward position because it forces it to maintain a very delicate balancing act between its chief military ally, the US, and also its main trading partner, which is China. China is very opposed to the THAAD defense system because they say that the radar could be used to spy on China. And it could be used to defeat Chinese missiles. After the THAAD launchers were deployed in 2017, China actually retaliated economically to punish South Korea until South Korea made some promises. One was that it would not install any more THAAD batteries. And then another promise was that the existing batteries in South Korea would not be targeted or would not be integrated into the larger US missile defense system. That's not a promise that South Korea could easily make because that's exactly what the Pentagon has in mind. The Missile Defense Agency began testing in 2020 to link the THAAD system in South Korea to the US Patriot or the PAC-3 missile systems. So the THAAD system in South Korea can also be integrated with other THAAD batteries in Japan, Guam, and also Central Missile Defense Control Center in Alaska. So in the future, it is very possible that THAAD could be repurposed to counter a threat from China. Anthony Kuhn of NPR recently did a fantastic story on this issue. So I'm gonna post the link in the chat so people can read more about it. I hope that answered your question.
This question is from Maud. How will the upcoming elections in South Korea affect peace prospects? Any chance a new government will choose a non-aligned role in the US-China conflict?
Yeah, the upcoming South Korean election is a big factor. I can discuss two aspects of the upcoming election. The first is the danger of a Yoon Suk-yeol presidency. Yoon Suk-yeol is a former public prosecutor. He is the nominee for the conservative People Power Party. What an ironic name, right? It's the Conservative Party, but their name is the People Power Party. He's the leading conservative candidate for South Korea's presidential election. And he faces off against Democratic Party nominee Lee Jae-myung. Yoon is known for his very hostile stance against North Korea and also his position in favor of the US-ROK alliance. If he is elected, he will undermine all past efforts for inter-Korean rapprochement and cooperate with the US in its drive toward confrontation against China. And this raises the specter of war on the Korean Peninsula to very dangerous levels. So if Yoon is elected, it will completely change the landscape for Korea peace activists. It will not only turn back the clock, but peace advocates will face serious backlash and will need solidarity and political cover from international and US peace advocates. So that's the first point. The second aspect of the current election season I want to mention is the labor-led movement to challenge the neoliberal economic system. So you may have seen the popular TV series Squid Game, right? And the downturn in the economy and the collapse of the neoliberal economic system have had serious consequences on the plight of ordinary workers in South Korea. The unemployment rate has increased rapidly for young people. So for young people in their 20s, I think it's as high as 25%. People in their 30s, 11%. People in their 40s, 10%. 1.57 million people are considered extremely temporary short-term workers. And this number is growing. Many people live in constant fear of job insecurity. The middle class is becoming thinner, and class polarization is acutely felt. And in this context, the KCTU, which is the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, has taken up the mantle of leading a united front to pose fundamental challenges to the neoliberal economic order. So they have put forth some very bold demands. One is to abolish what's called irregular work, meaning like part-time or temporary or contract labor with no benefits, and also to extend labor protections to all workers. Also, give workers power in economic restructuring decisions during times of crises, like a pandemic. Also, nationalize industries that are ailing, that have required public financing to bail them out. So for example, the airline industry, auto manufacturing, shipbuilding, they all took tax dollars to restructure during the pandemic. And then they're all bought by other corporations, and none of the benefits go back to the people who actually financed it. So the KCTU hopes to turn the next period leading up to the election in March into a period of mass protests that put these issues front and center of the national debates about the future of South Korean society. So rather than aligning with the established two-party system, like the Conservative Party or the Democratic Party, the KCTU actually brought together progressive opposition parties. There's, I think, 5 of them. There's like the Justice Party, the Progressive Party. There's several more, but I don't know the English name of their names. But they have brought these parties together and they plan on putting forth a unified candidate to represent the progressive camp. So right now, there's daily distraction created by the media, and there's a media spectacle between the conservative and democratic candidates. But ordinary people are increasingly rejecting the established political order, and they are taking to the streets to demand fundamental change. So that's the other aspect of the election I want to mention. And a few people in the US actually wrote a very great article explaining the situation in Truth Out. So I'm going to post that link in the chat so if you're interested, you can read more about that. There it is.
Our next question comes from Sally. Do we have any allies for Korea peace in the US State Department?
That is a very good question. This is just based on our experience at Women Across DMZ. The Biden administration, ironically, has been more difficult for us to engage than the previous administration, actually. I guess because, talking with Kim Jong-un was sort of a, part of Trump's showcase or something. We've actually found that it was easier to meet with people in his State Department to talk about, Korea peace and our views. But when the administration changed and we tried to engage the Biden administration first 100 days, we did not get a response at all. There is one issue that we were able to engage them on, which is the travel ban issue. As you know, the US has a ban on all US citizens traveling to North Korea. And that has very important consequences for Korean Americans who have family in North Korea. We have many members who are elderly. They used to be able to travel back and forth to North Korea to meet with their family members. All of that has been cut off since 2017, I believe. And humanitarian workers as well, unable to travel easily to North Korea. So we have been engaging with the State Department on that issue, although they decided to renew the travel ban last year, even despite our meetings with them. That's the only issue where we've been able to engage them, but on any other issue, we have not been able to engage the Biden administration.
This appears to be the last question. If anybody else has a last minute question, please put it in the chat right now. It's kind of a biggie, so you can take as long as you'd like or as short as you'd like to answer it. This is from Debbie. Why is the US driving towards a confrontation with China? What is the goal?
Yeah. Gosh, my mind is drawing a blank on a name. The name of the person in the White House who is the chief advisor on Indo-Pacific. He was in the Obama administration at the State Department. And he is now the advisor on Indo-Pacific. He's like the Asia czar person. Since the Obama administration, the United States has, yes, Kurt Campbell, thank you, Maud. The Obama administration has wanted to pivot to Asia for a long time. And now with the Biden administration, Kurt Campbell is, that's his agenda, is to basically shift US diplomatic foreign policy resources to Asia Pacific. Because, when the United States, as I mentioned before, the neoliberal economic system is ailing. And when you look across the world, you see that the Asia Pacific region is actually a very vibrant community, vibrant economy. It is growing. There's huge populations in Indonesia and India and China. And while the US was engaged for the past 20 years in the Middle East, China has been really growing its influence in the region as an economic power. And the US wants to make sure that it's part of that game. It does not want to concede to China to be the sole influencer of the region. It's important for the US to have its foothold there. However, it does not have all the resources that it requires. And so that's why there is so much of a focus on allies and partners in the region, right? South Korea being one of the top, Japan, Australia, India. The US wants to, basically mobilize or organize its allies in the region to contain China's rise, so that the US can have influence in the region. And it's not a bad thing for the United States to be an economic partner in the region, but when it talks about diplomacy, it's always gunboat diplomacy, right? It's always diplomacy backed by military power, and that's why I think there is an escalating arms race in the Asia Pacific right now, right? With the North Korea just claimed that it tested hypersonic missiles. China and Russia have hypersonic missiles. The US is trying to develop them quickly so that it can match their military prowess. And all of this sort of contest for hegemony is really what hurts ordinary people, right? And constant war threats, the elderly grandmothers in Soseongli putting their bodies on the line to stop the THAAD base. And then also for us in the United States, I mean, there are so many concerns that we have here, domestic issues, healthcare and climate change, and so many issues that are so important. But it's all being short-shrifted because of our, continued focus and priority on, building up military power so that, we stay number one. I think that's basically what's driving. And then also, as I mentioned in the beginning, the military industrial complex has its own logic, right? It has its own vested interests and things that drive it forward. The annual defense budget being one of them. But also like just so many people in that industry who have vested interests to keep it going, even if logically it doesn't make sense, and even if it is actually at the expense of our own security interests. So I believe that that's our job as peace activists, is to really expose that and develop a different kind of consciousness and vision among the American people, so that we start to demand something else, international cooperation, and not continued competition for hegemony.
Everything else in the chat is thanking you for the lecture, but more importantly, thanking you for your work and us at Upper Hudson Peace Action and Women Against War also want to thank you for your time tonight and all of the work that you do and for helping us. You've helped us quite a bit with your lobbying action and teaching us along the way. So we thank you very much for that. If anyone in the audience wants to unmute yourselves and say hello, I think you have some friends in the audience that have been dying to do that for the past hour. Please feel free to do that or say thank you in the chat so Hyun can read them.
Do we have time for any more questions?
Sure, yeah, if you'd like to ask one, go ahead.
I mean, I know we're at the top of the hour, so if the answer is no, I'm okay with that. But you know, you guys let me know what's okay or not.
Hyun, is it okay? She's saying yes.
Okay, wonderful. Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I have two questions that are really specific to the perspective on China, right? So the first question is, how much real influence does China have over North Korea? I mean, we know what we see on the media here that the perception is that China, Beijing, basically dictates what Pyongyang can do internationally. What is that real, or is that like something that the U.S. media likes to portray? And then the second question is, what does a peace between North and South Korea actually mean for China? Because the way that we see it here is that North Korea is one of the cards that China can play against the U.S. and, you know, let's say the West, but really the U.S. So if there is really a peace between North and South Korea, does that mean that's one less card that China can use? So those are my two questions.
Thank you for that question. I don't think China has the kind of influence over North Korea as the U.S. media makes it out to seem. North Korea's, I don't know, national philosophy, I guess, is self-reliance. And so even for their domestic purposes, it would not be acceptable for North Korea to seem like it is at China's beck and call. And North Korea, you know, does make its own decisions about its national priorities, its defense priorities. Having said that, I should mention that they are allies, China and North Korea, obviously. They have what's called a friendship treaty, similar to the US-South Korea Mutual Defense Treaty. If one is attacked, then they are committed to defend each other. And that goes back to the history of the Korean War, when China actually came to North Korea's aid during that war, because the US had pushed, I don't know if folks are familiar with the history of the Korean War, but basically the United Nations had given the United States and its unified command permission to repel the North Korean attack. And the unified command actually did that by pushing back the North Korean forces to the 38th parallel. And that was its mandate, to repel the North Korean attack. But instead, the US decided to push forward, cross the 38th parallel, and then push the troops all the way up to the Chinese border, which is why China became alarmed and got involved and came to North Korea's aid to push back the US forces. Mao Zedong actually sent his own son to the Korean War, to the war front, and his son died in the Korean War. And that is something that that the North Koreans never forgot. So the two, the US and South Korea, they always say, our alliance is forged in blood. Well, China and North Korea feel the same way. And what's dangerous is that if there is a confrontation between the United States and China, let's say in the Taiwan Strait, South Korea is automatically involved by virtue of the fact that it has a mutual defense treaty with the United States. North Korea is automatically involved by virtue of the fact that it has a similar treaty with China. So a confrontation between US and China has very serious consequences for the Korean Peninsula, and which is why it is very important for all who care about peace on the Korean Peninsula to also make sure that this escalation between US and China is prevented. And I believe that peace between the US and North Korea is actually a key. It's actually a key to the future of Northeast Asia, because that could actually significantly start to de-escalate the tension. And it's important for us to get to a point where there is multilateral cooperation for a peace system in Northeast Asia, meaning de-escalation, stopping the current very dangerous and costly arms race, and eventual disarmament in that region. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much for that. So again, thank you. Thank you so much. I hope you get a chance to read the chat. There are such beautiful things written to you. Bob, if you can save the chat and we can send that to Hyun, that would be fantastic. Lots of blessings, lots of thank yous. And again, we thank you very, very much for joining us this evening.